5 men, 1 car, axes, shotguns, and a mission. It wasn't just violence, it was vengeance. In a quiet neighborhood in Smethwick, West Midlands, a computer shop became a war zone. Broad daylight screams, gunfire, 2 men critically injured. What looked like a gangland shooting turned out to be something even more sinister, a brutal fallout from a long-simmering family feud. This is not just a crime story. It's a story about betrayal, loyalty, and the chilling cost of revenge. It was just afternoon on January 12, 2023, when the quiet of Bertram Road in Smethwick was shattered. A silver Ford Fiesta screeched to a halt outside City Computers. Masked men emerged, wielding axes and sawn-off shotguns. Within moments, windows were smashed, shots were fired, and 2 men lay wounded, one with a gunshot to the arm, another with a neck injury. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was the culmination of a simmering family feud that had escalated beyond control. At the center of this orchestrated attack was 22-year-old Jamal Hussein from Walsall, identified as the getaway driver. CCTV footage would later reveal the gang scouting their route the day before, and phone records showed a flurry of calls on the morning of the assault. This is the story of how a personal vendetta spiraled into a public act of terror, leaving a community in shock and a family torn apart. Welcome to the Smethwick gang feud that turned into a war zone. City Computers wasn't just a store, it was a pillar of the local community in Smethwick. Regular customers came in for simple tech repairs and everyday support. But on January 12, 2023, the shop turned into a battlefield. Just after midday, a silver Ford Fiesta pulled up outside. 5 men burst out, carrying axes, knives, and a shotgun. They weren't masked in panic, they moved with purpose. Surveillance footage would later show them scouting the scene the day before, meticulously planning the ambush. Inside, the attack was ferocious. A shotgun blast rang out, shattering the air and hitting one employee in the arm. Another was brutally assaulted, suffering a deep wound to the neck. Shoppers and pedestrians nearby ducked for cover as the suspects fled, leaving blood and broken glass behind. Police cordoned off Bertram Road within minutes. Armed officers swept the area, while forensics combed through shell casings and axe fragments. The media was quick to label it a targeted gang assault, but locals knew this wasn't just a turf war, it was personal. One of the victims, though seriously injured, survived and later provided chilling testimony. But even then, few were prepared for what would unfold in the coming weeks. Who were the attackers? Why City Computers? And what feud had spiraled so far out of control that a busy high street became the stage for a violent showdown? At the center of it all stood Jamal Hussein, just 22 years old, already tangled in a family vendetta that had been festering for years. He wasn't in a gang. He just worked there. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was like they wanted to make a point with blood. Patel, a family friend of one of the victims, stated. Jamal Hussein wasn't new to trouble. Known to police, but not as a leader, more a lieutenant in something older and deeper, a bitter family conflict spanning years and borders. His escape after the shooting sent waves through the community. For months, no one could say where he was. But what the police found in their investigation would expose more than just the gang. They'd uncover a methodical, premeditated attack designed to intimidate and maim. Within hours, detectives from the West Midlands Major Crime Unit were on the scene. They weren't just investigating an assault, they were piecing together a military-style ambush. Their first breakthrough? CCTV. Though the attackers were masked, the car wasn't. The silver Ford Fiesta was quickly traced through ANPR. The name that surfaced from the registration database rang alarms. It was tied to known gang activity in Walsall. Soon after, the digital breadcrumbs began to fall into place. Cell tower data showed a consistent trail. Phone pings matched the movements of the attackers. One number stood out, a device registered to Jamal Hussein, 22 years old, and already flagged in past gang-related intelligence. Further CCTV pulled from side roads showed him just blocks from the crime scene, walking calmly the day before the attack, possibly scouting. Then, a critical find, footage of Hussein getting into the very same Fiesta that would be torched hours later. The subject was identified as Jamal Hussein, believed to be driver and coordinator. Fled the UK following the incident. International alerts were issued. The police reported. Investigators found the getaway car burned out in a remote area outside Smethwick. It was a calculated move, standard for gang cleanup. But they left behind digital footprints. Detectives obtained warrants to dig into WhatsApp and SMS records. What they uncovered showed chilling coordination, voice notes, maps, and surveillance photos of the shop taken days before the attack. Other names started to appear in those chat logs: Azim Hussein, Haider Shabur, Ahmed Aumer. Each connected by blood, gang history, or shared grudges. The team began executing arrests. One by one, they brought in the co-conspirators. But Jamal Hussein was missing. He had boarded a plane the very next day, fleeing the UK. He wasn't just the getaway driver. He was central. Coordinated routes and timing, even picked who carried what weapon. It was surgical. The detective chief inspector stated. And now the man believed to have orchestrated the whole thing was gone. But he wasn't invisible. And what he didn't know was that the net was already closing in. Then came the twist: this wasn't just about a gangland grudge. This was about family. As detectives dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Several of the men involved shared more than just affiliations. They shared bloodlines. Brothers. Cousins. Childhood friends turned enemies. This wasn't the first time tensions had boiled over. Police files uncovered a string of previous altercations going back years: roadside fights, property damage, and threats. Always just below the radar. But this time, it had exploded into full-blown violence. The roots of the feud between the Hussein family and their rivals in Smethwick can be traced back to a series of conflicts in the 1990s. Long before the violent gang war of the early 2000s, there was a simmering tension between these families, sparked by disputes over territory, business interests, and personal vendettas. The Husseins, who had established themselves in the local community through a mix of legitimate and illicit activities, came into direct conflict with rival families, particularly those involved in drug trade operations and illegal gambling rings. It's reported that these families were vying for control of key areas in Smethwick, a working-class area with a mix of ethnic communities. Tensions escalated when the Husseins tried to expand their influence into new territories, which were already under the control of their rivals. One of the most significant moments that fueled the hatred between these families occurred during a series of violent clashes at a local pub in 1998. The pub, a known spot for both business deals and social gatherings, became the battleground for a violent confrontation between members of the two families. The altercation, which was sparked by a minor disagreement over a business deal, led to the first public displays of violent retaliation. There were reports of weapons being drawn, several individuals injured, and the incident left a deep scar in the community. As years passed, the rivalry became more personal. The Hussein family, in particular, was known for its involvement in more serious criminal enterprises, while their rivals engaged in their own violent acts in retaliation. However, it wasn't until the early 2000s that the feud reached its boiling point. Family members began to cross paths more frequently, leading to a brutal series of drive-by shootings, arson attacks, and physical assaults that terrorized the community. The Husseins, seeking to solidify their position, were suspected of orchestrating a series of violent events that ultimately culminated in the tragic escalation into a full-scale gang war. But, it wasn't just about criminal control. Deep-rooted personal grievances, such as betrayal, competition for power, and familial loyalties, ensured that this feud was not simply about business, it was about honor, reputation, and revenge. This earlier part of the feud sets the stage for the more well-known, violent gang wars that would later engulf Smethwick, particularly involving Jamal Hussein, a pivotal figure in the later stages. The attack on city computers wasn't just a gang flex, it was a message. A warning. And it had been years in the making. It wasn't random. It was calculated and personal. These weren't just rivals, they were connected. The betrayal was deeper. The motive wasn't drugs or territory. It was vengeance. Old wounds reopened. A business disagreement turned into a neighborhood standoff. The Hussein name came up again and again, not just Jamal, but others. Some had been targeted before. Some had retaliated. The city computer's ambush? That was just the climax of something that had been simmering quietly in the shadows of Smethwick for years. And now that police knew the real story, they weren't just hunting gang members. They were unraveling a family feud that had turned the streets into a war zone. When Jamal Hussein disappeared after the shooting, it wasn't panic, it was strategy. He left the country quickly and quietly. No social media trace. No slip-ups. For months, he vanished into silence. But the police weren't idle. They monitored family members. They followed the money. And they waited. Then in May 2024, more than a year after the shooting, Jamal returned to the UK, possibly thinking the heat had died down. It hadn't. As soon as he stepped off the plane, West Midlands police were waiting. Within minutes, he was surrounded. Handcuffed. The war zone he'd left behind was now waiting in court. Asterisk. He didn't resist. He knew it was over. But you could see it, he thought he had more time. A police source stated. Jamal wasn't alone in this. In April, Azim Hussein was arrested. Soon after, police tracked down Haider Shabir and Ahmed Aumer. All were pulled in as part of a sweeping joint operation across the Midlands. For the community, the arrests came as a shock. City computers reopened, but the fear hadn't gone away. Some locals said they always expected trouble. Others were stunned that boys from good families had crossed the line so violently. Asterisk. They were always around, but you never imagined they'd do something like that. Not like that. Sir Walter, a community resident, stated. Meanwhile, the prosecution's case grew stronger. They had Jamal's phone data, pinning him to the scene and connecting him to the others through coordinated chat logs. They had the surveillance footage, before, during, and after the crime. They even recovered digital messages showing the planning, time stamps, escape routes, and role assignments. Then came the forensic reports, residue matching the shotgun, and fingerprints from the abandoned vehicle. No longer circumstantial. This was conclusive. By the time the trial was scheduled, the case wasn't just about a gang attack, it was a blueprint of premeditated violence, documented across 2 countries and a year-long investigation. But for all the evidence, one question still haunted the courtroom. How did a family feud spiral into this? And what would justice look like in a case where loyalty had become lethal? Under UK law, possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life is a grave offence. According to Section 16 of the Firearms Act 1968, it's illegal to possess any firearm or ammunition with the intent to endanger life or cause serious injury to property, regardless of whether any injury has occurred. The Sentencing Council outlines that this offense carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment, with sentencing ranges typically between 4 to 22 years, depending on factors such as the level of planning, the role of the offender, and the harm caused or intended. In September 2024, justice was served at Worcester Crown Court. Jamal Hussein, having pled guilty to possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, received a sentence of 9 years and 2 months. His role as the orchestrator of the attack was a significant factor in the court's decision. His cousin, Azim Hussein, was sentenced to 8 years, reflecting his active participation in the planning and execution of the crime. Haider Shabir, identified as one of the primary assailants wielding a weapon during the attack, received a 14-year sentence. Ahmed Aumer was handed 12 years and 6 months, acknowledging his involvement in the violent incident. Other individuals connected to the case received varying sentences, each reflecting their specific roles and levels of involvement. For the Smethwick community, the repercussions extended beyond the courtroom. The violent episode left a lasting scar on the neighborhood's sense of security. Local businesses, including city computers, experienced a decline in patronage as fear permeated the area. Residents grappled with the reality that such violence could erupt in their midst, challenging their perceptions of safety and community cohesion. Law enforcement officials emphasized that this incident was not an isolated case but indicative of deeper issues related to gang affiliations and familial disputes. They warned of the potential for similar occurrences if underlying tensions remained unaddressed. This case underscores the importance of early intervention and community engagement. Without proactive measures, such conflicts can escalate with devastating consequences. As the convicted individuals began serving their sentences, the community faced the challenge of healing and rebuilding trust. The event served as a stark reminder of the destructive potential of unresolved conflicts and the critical role of collective vigilance in maintaining public safety. A quiet computer shop. A broad daylight ambush. Families torn apart, not by strangers, but by their own. Jamal Hussein now serves time for a crime that sent shockwaves through Smethwick. But the story doesn't end with his conviction. Because this wasn't just about guns or gangs. It was about history, pride, and a chain of choices that led to blood on the floor. The question now is, who's next? For every feud that explodes into violence, there are a dozen more waiting, fueled by ego, territory, and silence. So we ask you, what would you do if this was your street? Your family? Your town? If this story gave you pause, subscribe and join us as we uncover the true crime stories hiding in plain sight. This was the Smethwick gang feud that turned into a war zone.